From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about recent cyber trends and developments in the Middle East, President Biden's trip to the region, and MEI's new book, Cyber War and Cyber Peace: Digital Conflict in the Middle East. For those of you that are interested, the book is available for pre-order now and will be released in the U.S. in the next few weeks. It's the first in the new MEI policy series, published in conjunction with Bloomsbury IB Tauris. If you want to find out more about it, there's a link to the landing page of the book in the description for this week's episode. You can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. I'm joined today by Chris Kubecka, the Distinguished Chair of MEI's Cybersecurity and Emerging Technology Program, and the CEO of HIPAASEC. Chris, welcome back to the program, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Alistair.
Start out with the new book, Cyber War and Cyber Peace. Can you tell our listeners a little bit more about it and why it might be useful for people who want to better understand what's happening in either cyber or the Middle East?
Definitely. And thank you for the question. One of the things that I really enjoy about the book is the fact that in the region of the Middle East and Northern Africa, it is a real hotbed of cyber and technology right now. And although the news doesn't filter through as much with the Western media as it should, there's all sorts of dynamics going on. The newest and greatest spyware, offensive technologies, defensive, surveillance, you name it. There's a lot of push for development and technology in the region. And with that comes the shadow of cyber issues.
And just following up on that, what did you find kind of most interesting and most compelling about the book as a reader and a cyber expert?
Well, the things that I found most compelling was the ease in which many governments use surveillanceware. For example, starting all the way back during Arab Spring was a big thing. There's a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation being used by both governments and also private actors. And there's your typical cybercrime as well. But since there's active wars going on in the region, there's also a lot of very dynamic and very emerging cyber offensive operations at the same time.
Moving on from the book to take a sort of macro level look at the Middle East right now, what are the key recent trends or developments that you're seeing on the cyber front?
Well, we're seeing a lot more of information campaigns. And this is very interesting because it's following the trends worldwide, except for the fact that the information trends are just a wee bit different in the Middle East. Some of them are definitely from private actors. For example, there has been a lot of activity by what we would refer to as hacktivist groups, which have been able to get a hold of various different types of technology or develop their own, which has made it extremely dynamic in the region.
As talks to revive the Iran nuclear deal stall, there's been a lot of discussion lately about Iran's regional activities, including its nuclear program, its missile program, and its proxy forces like Hezbollah. But there's been much less attention paid to its cyber activities. Why do you think that is, and what should people be focusing on in that regard?
Well, I think it's a shame that some governments have not yet understood what some of the cyber threats are coming out of Iran. For example, it's much easier to sell cyber weaponry than it is to smuggle physical arms. So there's been this long reach out of, for example, Iran, selling some of their cyber offensive tools to groups even all the way down to Burkina Faso, with a group of Islamist terrorists that they have been actively supporting. And these types of tools, they can be proliferated rather quickly just by downloading files and moving at the speed of light versus trying to arrange physical tools. But they can have similar or devastating effect, especially when there's all sorts of disinformation involved with them as well.
A significant part of the shadow war that we've seen playing out between Iran and Israel seems to be taking place in cyberspace. We've seen attacks on Israeli government websites in March, more recently on Iranian manufacturing facilities last month. How was the sort of cyber campaign of that shadow war playing out, and what stood out to you about it?
One of the things that's really stood out for me is this group called Predatory Sparrow. And they are a hacker group that has been able to infiltrate Iranian telecommunications and also start a fire in a steel mill with a very clear message. And that message is that they want a change in the regime. And previous to this, it's been quite unusual for a group such as Predatory Sparrow to be able to get a hold of these types of tools to basically go after different types of manufacturing. Manufacturing is a bit different than your regular desktop computer trying to get in. You actually have to have a higher level of sophistication, and also you have to understand the difference in technologies because they're quite different. So that's one of the things that's really stood out, and it could be a interesting yet at times disturbing trend that various groups and private actors and hacktivists are able to actually cause destruction.
For our audience, most of whom probably don't follow the field as closely as you do, what are one or two regional cyber issues that they should definitely be aware of and paying attention to?
I would say two. One would be the use and misuse of different types of cyber offensive tools in regards to some of the Iranian attacks demanding a change in regime. Another is, for example, in Israel, obviously they are facing various different types of threats. With the recent Ukraine and Russian war, Iran has become more emboldened and started additional physical and also cyber attacks, some of which have involved even doxing on state television in Iran the names, addresses, photos of Israeli defenders who have nothing to do with the offensive side. So this could be a very disturbing trend. We've also seen similar activity stretching all the way to Ukraine, with Russia doing the same thing. So when you look at the sophistication and rise of sophistication and offensive tools in the region, and also the damaging effects that a dox or spilling private information out to the public, people who are just defending, not offending, this can be a very dangerous trend and keep many people out of the field.
Turning now to President Biden's trip to the Middle East, he's visiting the region from July 13 through 16 with stops in Israel and Saudi Arabia. Cyber doesn't seem to be especially high on the agenda, but there is one issue that may come up behind closed doors, and that's, as you referenced earlier, spyware. The track record there is pretty concerning, especially for the Israeli firm MSO Group and its Pegasus spyware. Reports suggested it's been regularly abused by autocratic governments, both in the region and elsewhere, against political opponents, journalists, activists, and the like. I'm curious to get your thoughts on the issue as a security expert. What do you think Biden should do there, and how should the broader issue of spyware be approached?
Well, one of the things that Biden can do is approach it as, are we going to proliferate these types of surveillanceware outside the particular countries? For example, if one particular country tries to destabilize or create some sort of competitive advantage using spyware that could destabilize another country, this should be very concerning because it's typically in the US's interest for there not to be additional unrest in the region on top of what there already is. Another thing is the NSO group, that's the tip of the iceberg. They're actually not the biggest player on the market. And one of the reasons why is we have this agreement in many Western countries called the Wassenaar Agreement, which also ties in Article 13 the use of different types of surveillanceware. Well, there are no countries that are full signatories in the Middle East. Israel only acknowledges it. And there are many homemade types of surveillanceware that are already being built, and especially GCC countries who have the economic means to do so. So I would hope that Biden would look at the fact that these types of tools can be destabilizing and cause rifts between our allies, which does not make our foreign policy in the region very strong, and look at some sort of agreement, at least starting with the GCC countries, how to rein in the use of some of these tools. For example, restricting the use of them against another country, similar to the Wassenaar Agreement, but for at least that region of the world.
So establishing some sort of rules of the road that everyone can agree to.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm reminded of last week I was in Geneva for a United Nations event, and it was brought up that there should be some sort of, finally agreed upon definition of some of these tools, what they're used for, and how they should be used, and some legal means to then say, hey, country X, you happen to break this, you could be involved in sanctions now.
One of the key agenda items for Biden's visit is to promote regional defense cooperation among American allies in the region, especially between Israel and Arab states. Where do things stand on that front in regard to cyber, and what would the sort of cyber equivalent of a regional defense framework look like?
Well, it's unfortunate that there aren't regional frameworks and allied agreements such as kind of like a NATO for the Middle East. But I would like to see something like that because what happens is what affects one country can affect another. There are transnational pipelines, for example, that if they come under cyber attack or physical attack, this can be problematic for other countries. So ideally, I would like to see at least starting with some of the GCC countries, which have the economic means to take a look at some sort of cyber alliance. We have something similar for European Union countries where I live, that if one country comes under attack, the other countries give aid, and they also share pertinent information about the attack so that they can hopefully halt the attack at their borders.
Beyond what we've discussed already, are there any other cyber and tech issues that might not be on the agenda, but that Biden should be discussing with regional leaders?
One of the topics that I would like to be discussed is misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, and propaganda. Recently, Canada actually added to their sanctions list lists of propaganda websites that Russia was using against Ukraine. And propaganda can spread very quickly, especially in regions where you have high connectivity, like the Middle East and the GCC. They actually have more mobile internet phone usage on average than the United States. So these things can spread like wildfire. And one of the big fears amongst some nations is a repeat of Arab Spring or any type of unrest. But when you have a lot of propaganda spreading so quickly, things can shift very quickly. So, one of the things that I would encourage Biden to do is look at the propaganda issue because that seems to be more dangerous nowadays in some ways than different types of cyber attacks. I believe one of my friends coined it as psychological malware, and it should be very concerning and should be reined in some manner.
Before we wrap up, I want to kind of ask you an open ended question. Looking at the regional cyber and tech landscape, what are you most concerned about going forward on the one hand, and what are you most optimistic or hopeful about on the other?
Well, I'm very concerned over the fact that different types of surveillanceware and cyber offensive tools can be developed in certain areas of the Middle East, such as the GCC, where they have the economic means to do so. If they don't have the talent in-house, they certainly can hire someone like me for $1 million+ a year and get that talent very quickly. And since there are no cyber weaponry controls or limits in the region, this can be very dangerous. We've now seen what some call the fifth domain looks like when it comes to using different types of cyber tools against another government or group, and it can be extremely damaging. So we need to really look at these issues very carefully because the US and some of its allies need to understand we're no longer in the analog world and we need to step out of its shadow and realize we're in the digital world. Now, for optimistic things, I see so much potential. When I visit different countries in the Middle East and Northern Africa, I can get 5G on my phone. I know that there's all sorts of government pushed and focus on different types of machine learning. They're developing quantum computing and all sorts of other things that, if our listeners understand what I'm saying, they've got the money and the means and the drive. And this is a wonderful thing because they're trying to cut down on bureaucracy, trying to improve living standards through digital technology in a way that I haven't seen except in places like Singapore and some European countries. And I think that there's a huge amount of potential. And we also need to recognize the fact that they are on the forefront of emerging technology.
Before we wrap up, any final thoughts?
Well, I've got a few final thoughts. Some of the things that we need to ensure until there are different types of cyber agreements in the Middle East and Northern Africa is it's extremely important for the rest of the world that has capabilities to help out those countries in case of a major cyber attack to do so. For instance, there's been some talk and discussion about what would happen if, for example, the Suez Canal came under cyber attack. Where could they go for assistance? Or if what I'd mentioned previous transnational pipeline infrastructure, which could come under attack in a similar manner to Colonial Pipeline. And so the region needs additional allies when it comes to the cyber realm. And I hope that we're able to get those additional allies because it's no longer an if, it's a win nowadays.
That's all the time we have for today, but thank you very much for joining the program once again, Chris.
Thank you so much, Alistair.
You can follow all of MEI's coverage of cyber and tech on our website at www.mei.edu. Once again, our new book is Cyber War and Cyber Peace, Digital Conflict in the Middle East. It's the first in the new MEI policy series, published in conjunction with Bloomsbury Abbey Taurus. It's available now for pre-order and will be released in the US shortly. If you want to find out more about it, there's a link in the description for this week's episode. That's all the time we have for this week. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in and to our production team for their work on this week's episode. You can follow MEI on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.